Great. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Nick. So I just have to let you know I'm not going to look probably right at the camera just because I'm using my laptop internal camera and the presentation is going to be on one of the extra monitors. So yeah, so that's what's going on. So I'm going to talk today about, actually, I guess I'll be looking at the notes, the notes field here on PowerPoint. So I will be looking at the camera. So I'm going to be talking about some of my work in rural Alabama on wastewater issues that we have here. Okay, and just to let you know, my background is I live in Alabama now. I'm from the Northeast. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I went to Penn State, did a civil engineering degree there. I did a master's in environmental engineering at Virginia Tech. I worked for a little while for Black and Veatch, and then I went back for my PhD at University of North Carolina. And I worked mostly during my PhD on water and wastewater issues in developing countries, both lab studies and field studies I worked on during my PhD. And then I did a postdoc at the University of North Carolina Water Institute at UNC Chapel Hill, focused again, mostly on developing countries. And when I moved to Alabama, it became a little more challenging to do developing country oriented work. One is just because the grad students that I had at UNC were doing environmental engineering in a school of public health. Many of them were very interested in doing that sort of work. We were building off a very good foundation for international work and relationships that we had. The second thing was, over the course of a few years, we had 5 kids. We had one when we moved here to Alabama, and then we had another, and then we had triplets. Big surprise having triplets. So I basically became totally immobile. So my work relocated to mostly rural Alabama, where we have, frankly, situations that are very common in developing countries in some of these rural areas. And I'm going to talk about some of that today and some of characterizing the scope of the problem, and then also focusing on what can we do to solve this problem. So first of all, this is a collaboration. Kevin White at University of South Alabama. He did his PhD at Virginia Tech and has been in South Alabama since he started working as a faculty member. Is actually, he was the lead on this project, the lead PI. I'm going to talk about some work that I did on another project where I was the lead PI. Most of this work is funded by the Environmental Protection Agency through what's called the Gulf of Mexico program. And it focuses on the 5 states that border on the Gulf of Mexico, and wastewater being discharged untreated, which I'll talk about today, into those rivers that drain into the Gulf is a big concern for them. So that's where most of our funding has come from. Mark Barnett at Auburn University is also collaborating on this. The collaboration has expanded. Now Columbia University is really involved, Georgia Tech, UC Irvine. So it's a huge collaboration now when we're looking at solutions. But in terms of characterizing the problem, it was mostly a team in Alabama that was doing this initially and kind of bringing this issue to broader attention. All right, so just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, about 75% of people in the United States, when they flush their toilets, when water goes down the shower drain, when it goes down the sink, washing machine, dishwasher, it all goes to a sewer pipe. It goes to a centralized municipal wastewater treatment facility. About a quarter of people in the United States who don't have access to a sewer are required to treat their own wastewater typically right on their property. Okay, there are some cases where they'll go to an adjacent lot, but mostly you've got to treat your own wastewater if you don't have access to a sewer and you're not paying a sewer bill. So by far the most common way that people do this is with what's called a conventional septic system. And that would include the tank, which everyone talks about. Oh, they said you have a septic tank, but the action's really in the drain field and in the soil beneath the drain field. So this is just a very, very simple cross section that shows the main components. You've got a pipe that goes from your home to a septic tank, and that pipe needs to have some slope to it because it's going to have solids in there. The septic tank, which basically serves as primary treatment, settling the solids. We're going to have oils and greases floating to the top. And there's some digestion that occurs in there as well, mostly anaerobic digestion of the solids down at the bottom. So when you think about a big conventional wastewater treatment plant, the equivalent processes that are happening in that tank would be primary treatment on the liquid side, and then the solids are being there's primary solids being handled. So that effluent, but just liquids, not that we don't want the solids, we don't want the oils and greases, we just want the liquid zone, goes typically through a filter. Most states have a regulation that you have to have a filter on the back end so that solids don't get out into your distribution field, into your drain field. And then that drain field will be dug typically a foot below the surface. And then it'll be, say, a foot to 24 inches deep, depending, and then 2 or 3 feet wide, okay, dug with a backhoe. It'll be filled with gravel in older systems. Nowadays, chamber systems like Infiltrator are much more common. And I'll talk about those when we get to solutions. But basically what happens is that wastewater goes out a 4-inch PVC pipe with holes drilled in the bottom. It goes down through the gravel, or it goes just down to the bottom of the trench if it's a chamber system. And then that wastewater is going to infiltrate into the subsurface. Okay, over time, a biomat will grow on the bottom of the trench, and then it'll eventually grow up the sidewalls of the trench as well. That enhances treatment. So it's going to basically strain out any solids. Almost anything bigger than a virus can get strained out by a substantive biomat. And then what happens with the biomat at the bottom of the trench is it serves as a barrier to flow. It's going to have a very low hydraulic conductivity, provide a lot of resistance to flow. What that means is when the wastewater does get through, it goes into the subsurface into an unsaturated zone, and that's going to enhance treatment. Okay, so you don't want the water table to be at the bottom of the trench. That really undermines the effectiveness of your treatment, and especially for dissolved constituents and viruses, they can just get into the groundwater and move, and then someone could use that groundwater and get sick. Okay, so there are setback rules for how far a well has to be from a drain field on a septic system, but there's also, probably more importantly, rules about how close that seasonal water table can be to the bottom of the trench. All right, so in most places, a conventional septic system is affordable, say $3,000 for installation, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less in Alabama, a little bit more in other places where cost of living is a little bit higher. But if you think about this septic system, it's going into your property. It should work for 20, 30, 40 years. And you're paying up front one time. You could even incorporate it into the cost of the home in some cases, into your mortgage, into your mortgage. So once that's in the ground, it should work for a really long time. Okay, and then every 3-5 years, you want to get your septic tank pumped. In colder areas, it might be a little bit more frequent because the digestion happens more slowly, the digestion of the solids. But in general, we're talking about a long-term solution that's very affordable. Okay, it doesn't work in all soils, though. Okay, I talked about high water table. If you have places with really high water table, you can't use one of these systems. A problem that we have in Alabama, we do have places with high water table, but the biggest problem is through the central part of the state. We have this, what's called prairie-like blackland prairie soils, okay? You'll see these huge, massive prairies, often used for grazing cattle or something like that. And they have either right at the surface or just underneath the topsoil on the surface, this really dense clay that's actually a shrink swell clay. And I'll show you that in just a second. But here's the area geographically that we're concerned about with Alabama and Mississippi. These are soil maps from USDA. They were, I guess, different people provided the color on these. So it's the kind of like the dark brown, has a slight army green color to it there in northeastern Mississippi. And that crescent comes down and goes right across central Alabama. Those are areas where, now soil isn't this simplistic, you know, it's more, there'll be little patches of different types of soil, but this is the dominant type of soil in these areas. This is called a blackland prairie soil. For geologists, they call it a vertisol. But in Alabama, this is where you can see the A for the University of Alabama there, and then the state capital in Montgomery. Most of that area is very rural, okay? So not a lot of sewer systems. So the majority of population in these counties is responsible for treating their own wastewater on site. This is what the vertisols look like, okay? When they're dry, if you have a drought or you got a long dry period in the summer, they'll basically shrink and crack. When they get wet, they swell up to an extent that they basically become completely impermeable. And obviously, if you have a trench dug in this, and even if it looks dry at the time, you start putting wastewater into that, it's going to swell up, it's going to seal off, and it's going to make conventional septic systems fail. Okay. Another problem that we have in rural Alabama is we have a lot of poverty. Okay. So this would be 11 of the Black Belt counties that are the most rural. Um, you may not be able to see completely all the numbers or absorb all the numbers on this table. But basically, we have very low population density in these counties. We have a very low median household income compared to Alabama, let alone compared to the rest of the U.S. We have a high proportion of the population on disability. There was a story on NPR about this a couple of years ago about how a lot of people were being put on permanent disability in Alabama. A lot of people for things like diabetes. College graduation rates are really low in this area. And then a lot of the young people who do go to college, they don't come back. So a lot of the young people leave, and we end up with an older aging population. And most of these counties actually have declining population rather than growing, because there's not a lot there for a huge population of young people to do for good jobs. So in this area, we end up with a low tax base. We end up with we have very low population density. Usually there'll be one, like the county seat will have, the town that's the county seat will have a sewer system that runs right up to the city limits. And then there's one or two other towns that have a small sewer system. But 75 to 80% of the population will be treating their wastewater on site, or they should be treating the wastewater on site. Okay. Because the soils don't drain, most on-site systems rely on infiltrating wastewater into the ground. We end up with people being basically stuck and not having any good option that they can afford and that can be permitted for on-site wastewater treatment. The counties were named they're called the Black Belt counties. They were named for the rich, dark topsoil. It was great for growing cotton. These were areas that had a lot of slaves back in the 1800s, 1700s. And there's a lot of legacies of discrimination in these populations as well that have led to this rural poverty, a lot of land that doesn't have clear title, which causes problems for trying to put in on-site wastewater systems as well. Most of these counties have, say, 25 to 40% of households living in poverty. And outside of the Seward areas, that's going to be higher. The Seward area, the towns in the Seward areas are going to, in general, be the wealthier areas. And then you will have some wealthy ranchers here and there. But for the most part, the people outside the towns that have sewer are going to be poorer in general. So we have a lot of rural poverty. So what happens is you have people who can't afford an on-site system that can be permitted. You have no sewer, and you have people spread out all over the place. So we end up with a lot of failing systems where wastewater backs up into the yard. So you can imagine you put a trench in, you send the wastewater in. Over time, maybe you can get a little of it into the ground, especially when it's dry. Maybe you get some evapotranspiration, but eventually it's coming to the surface. So we get wastewater surfacing in yards. And on the bottom left, you can see a ball that's in a pool of sewage. Kids think it's just a puddle. They don't think, oh, there's no reason why water should be here. They're going to pick it up and play with that ball. Dogs love to get in these puddles. In the summer, you see them all the time. Whenever there's one of these puddles, they'll go lay in it, stay cool. When they're about to shake off, you do not want to be you don't want to be around them. Also, indoor-outdoor pets. There's a lot of potential for health risk. If that pet is going outside for a time, gets in that sewage, and then comes inside, you've got a lot of pathogens that could be spread in the home. And then we also have something called straight pipes, and a straight pipe is what it sounds like. It's a pipe straight from typically a mobile home, but sometimes a conventional stick-built home, just going to the surface. In this part of Alabama, we have these prairie landscapes. There's not a lot of elevation change. So what that means is there's not a lot of perennial streams that flow near homes. So if you're talking about West Virginia or Kentucky, for example, another place where they have a lot of straight pipes, most people have a little creek that runs behind their home that will wash that wastewater away. And then there's clear risk for downstream people. But for the household, there's probably not that much risk. It's basically like flushing to a sewer that has poor or no wastewater treatment. Whereas in Alabama, most people live up against the woods. So they will usually discharge a pipe to the woods. It'll go under some leaves and kudzu and other weeds and things, and that's usually a low point. So they'll send it to a low point. It's kind of sits there, trickles away, and then when it rains, it all washes down to some creek, a stream, then it goes to a river. There's also places where you have a mobile home on the middle of a lot that doesn't have a discharge point, and you can see in the upper right, this family has actually dug a trench to take their wastewater away. I would say those situations are not typical of the straight pipes that I've seen. Most people have a place they can discharge it that's kind of hidden. Um, Also, if you have a mobile home, it's really easy to kind of peek underneath and see where the wastewater is going. So it's hard to hide a straight pipe when you have a mobile home. Whereas when somebody has a stick-built conventional home, usually they've got a slab and they've got a pipe buried, and they run it off somewhere where and no one knows about it. Okay, so this is a big problem. It's gotten actually some media attention. There's a UN Human Rights to Water and Sanitation Special Rapporteur who came to the state in 2010, put out a report in 2011 talking about this problem, that this was actually a violation of the UN declared human right to water and sanitation happening in the United States. There were also some investigations with homeless populations in the United States. There was an article in Al Jazeera online in 2015 that was the first big media coverage that I saw about this. Frankly, Al Jazeera is considered, not by a lot of people, they don't want to take seriously what's in Al Jazeera. The New York Times actually had a story a year later that got a lot of attention. The Guardian has picked this up. There was actually another UN Special Rapporteur visit, this Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty, that said, that quote at the top, worst poverty in the developed world, said this Special Rapporteur. And then there was an article in Newsweek about that, and that's the headline from Newsweek, actually, you see at the top there. There was actually also a long video, I think like a 4-5 minute video segment, maybe it was a little longer than that, on PBS NewsHour in 2018. So this has had some attention. People say, how is this going on in the United States? I found out about this when I got here. People told me you'll see similar things in Alabama to what you saw when you were doing field work in the developing world. And I really didn't take it seriously. They said, oh, because I'd been, to Haiti, rural Cambodia, rural Vietnam, Ghana, northern Ghana. And I really didn't think those sorts of conditions existed in the United States, but I found quickly that they actually did. And it was crazy. The first time I went out to do field work, I actually had deja vu. It was really just like being back in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, at some isolated village where you could smell sewage everywhere. It's hot and humid. And there was a trailer there that had a 4-inch pipe going along the ground, and they had built up a little berm to collect the sewage, but it was just all pooling basically around right near their property. And frankly, at that point, I thought, wow, I've been working in developing countries all this time. The state of Alabama pays my salary. I work for a public university here. I really feel an obligation to try to address this problem for the people of the state. So I've been working on it since then, basically. And thankfully, I have a College of Engineering and a department that's actually supportive of this sort of work. One thing that you find in engineering departments is they want, a lot of them are really just interested in hard engineering, and they're not interested, and even if you're doing a project that it could have a huge impact on people of the state, and it's a state university, a lot of the time, frankly, the administration and the other faculty are not supportive of this type of work. I have to say that it's been really a blessing for me that I never got one question about whether or not I should be doing this type of work from the administration here. So so what did we know coming into this? So we knew that there weren't a lot of sewer systems. We knew rural residents didn't have the money to get viable options otherwise. We knew probably it impacted a large percentage of the Black Belt. There's a lot of rural poverty. There's the soil is all throughout this area. And the lack of key infrastructure also limits economic development. So if you drive on some interstates, like Interstate 65 from Montgomery down to the coast of Alabama, or if you're going to New Orleans, for example, you can drive 20, 30 miles without seeing an exit that has a fast food restaurant. And the reason is because there's no sewer at those locations. And putting in an on-site wastewater treatment system is too risky for a restaurant like that, especially one that's dealing with a lot of grease. So you can go, no one wants to put in a business where an on-site wastewater problem could cause them to shut down that business. And it's something that I think is unappreciated. But if you're ever driving through really rural areas, notice what's at those exits, and you'll often notice that it correlates with where sewer is located. And it's worse in this type of soil in Alabama, but that's also a consideration in a lot of other in places all over the United States. So there's a lot of anecdotal reports, but not a lot on the scale or scope of the problem. So we wanted to figure out where was this going on geographically, how many households is this happening to, and then we could infer what's the volume of untreated wastewater that's being discharged to the surface, in addition to the failing septic systems. You know, we have good data on estimates of water use in the home, so we can use those with estimates of how many people have straight pipes to look at volume discharge. And then what are the impacts then on water quality and then on public health as well. So there was a study actually in 2005, 2006, and Kevin White, who's my collaborator now, who I talked about earlier, he led this study. Okay, it was in 2005. They published a report in 2006, but it really didn't get out anywhere. You can't even find it online. But basically, he worked with Robert Jones, who was a retired health department environmental health supervisor, to look at 4,000 homes in Bibb County. Bibb County is just east of Tuscaloosa. The soil's not that bad. It's not actually part of that black belt soil, but they found 15% of people without sewer, of homes without sewer, had straight pipes, which I thought was completely outrageous. I'd never heard anything like that in the United States. And then 50%, including those 15%, 50% showed evidence of sewage on the surface. Now that means that could be actual sewage liquid sitting on the surface, or it could mean just above the drain field, you got really robust growth of the grass. And what that indicates is the wastewater is not going down like it's supposed to, it's going up. Okay, so soil and poverty are not as bad in Bibb County as in most black belt counties. So we could infer probably we're going to get worse conditions in the black belt. You know, so just for example, Bibb County has about 18% poverty. Hale County, which is just southwest of there, it's just south of our university, is about 27%. And then Wilcox County, another county that we work in, is almost 40% rural poverty. Actually, probably higher in rural areas if we could isolate that, but 40% of households overall in poverty. And then we would expect then that the straight pipes and the failing septic systems would be more common in these areas. So what about health impacts, right? So if people have, you know, there's all this wastewater all over the place, we would expect to see that in the health outcomes of the population. But there's an important point. These areas have really poor access to healthcare, okay? Most kids will have it through Medicaid, but most counties only have 1 or 2 primary care physicians for the whole county. So one per every 7 to 10,000 people. And a lot of adults just don't have health care until they get on Medicare when they get old. There's not a lot of surveillance for infectious diseases specifically. So if someone has some sort of gastrointestinal illness, they're going to treat it like they would treat some normal diarrhea, even though it could be something like a helminth, like a worm that's associated with exposure to raw sewage. So there was a survey in the early 90s by a master's student at UAB of Wilcox County and kids who were in a program. So it wasn't a representative sample. It was kids in this specific program for kids who came from poor areas, basically. But a third of those kids were under 10 had tested positive for 1 or more helminths. And that's a roundworm or a flatworm. That was done by microscopy so that they could see the worms in the stool. There's data from 2017 that claimed hookworm in adults in Lowndes County. They were using a quantitative PCR technology. They basically looking for the genes associated with hookworm. The concentrations were always really low. And I'm actually kind of skeptical of those findings specifically. There are 2 teams following up right now, though, one from UAB and Georgia Tech and one from Baylor. So hopefully we'll know actually within a few months whether those findings were legitimate or not. So what are the methods we're trying to use? Well, we're going to do site-by-site inspections. We got a little bit of money to send out. Actually, Robert Jones, the guy had done those inspections in Bibb County. We got to send him out. We couldn't do a comprehensive study like he had done for a county, but we could get 7 to 10% of the households and try to get a representative sample. Talking to local stakeholders. So I sit here in my office in Tuscaloosa. There's only so much I can know about what's going on down there. You know, I know about the treatment technologies and everything. I can get the concepts, but there are people who've been working in this area, installing on-site systems, pumping systems for 20, 30 years. They know where these straight pipes are located. They know who's got a failing system. So talking to those people to learn. And then I had a student who was great at GIS and took a digital elevation model with topography to do flow routing. So if there's a straight pipe, we could figure out when it rained, where's that going to end up? And then we could locate our water sampling efforts upstream and downstream of known straight pipes so that we could isolate and try to figure out that contamination. All right, so site-by-site inspections. We did one in Wilcox County. That's about 2 hours south of Tuscaloosa. We got almost 2/3 of our homes were mobile homes, okay? And that's just representative of that rural area. And then 104 would have been conventional stick-built wood frame homes. Only less than 7% of our sample actually had a system permitted by the health department, which was stunning for me. I couldn't believe it. But Robert Jones actually used to supervise the health department in this area, so he knew from his experience, and he could ask the current workers, "Hey, have you had new permits?" And it was a stunning fact that less than 7% had been permitted. Okay, so we've got over 90% without a permitted system. 60% actually had a straight pipe that was visible when we inspected the site. Okay, I shouldn't say we. I don't go out there and do these inspections. Frankly, it's not safe to send people poking around people's backyards in a rural area. I wouldn't send my students out to do it. I sent someone from the county who had worked there for a long time, and people knew him. He and his wife was a home health care nurse, so she knew people all over. So they'd actually go out the day before, talk to a person they knew, and then their neighbor would tell everybody else, "Hey, he's going to be coming out. They're doing this study. They're trying to get people good wastewater treatment." So it's really hard to do this sort of field work, I have to say. It's not, you can't just say, "Oh, we're going to do an inspection of every site in a county." It's too expensive, and frankly, it's not safe. So 60% had a straight pipe. And like I said, with a mobile home, it's easy. You just kind of look underneath and you know where that fixture, where that pipe is coming from the toilet. You can just see where that goes. And if it goes above ground, if it goes into the ground, but it goes off to the woods, if there's no room for a drain field, you know it's probably a straight pipe. And then 34% were unpermitted. We couldn't tell whether it was a straight pipe or whether they had tried to have some sort of system installed. People do hire unlicensed installers because it's cheaper. So they might have had a system. They were trying to get wastewater into the ground, but we couldn't tell, and it wasn't permitted. I will also say that people do put a tank in the ground sometimes to take care of the solids, and they don't want toilet paper getting out into their yard or whatever out back, but the liquid is coming out, and that most of the pathogens stay with the liquid. Also, there are people who will put like a 55-gallon drum in the ground or like an old refrigerator or something just to take the solids out. There's actually a case where somebody buried an old car and ran a pipe into the trunk and then ran it out by the engine to take care of the solids. Yeah, I mean, I guess it solved two problems at once, right? So inspection data in Wilcox County. So just to let you know, we see things like this where along the river, the more desirable property, it's more vacation homes, they'll tend to have either a permitted system or they don't have a straight pipe that you can see. They don't want their neighbors to see this white pipe coming out from their home. I do have to say, I wouldn't be surprised if there are a number of straight pipes that are running straight under the river that were done surreptitiously. There are contractors in Alabama who will work at night, who will do trenching, and when no one can see, and will run a straight pipe. And then when you come up the hill, away from the river, there's a kind of an informal community up there. It's a big piece of property that was owned by someone a long time ago, probably sharecroppers, who passed it down through the generations. No one person really has clear title to that land, but a lot of sons and daughters and cousins and grandkids move mobile homes onto the property, and most of the time they don't have a permit. They won't have a permitted system. Oftentimes they'll just run a straight pipe like everyone else does. And frankly, when you get a situation like this where up gradient of wealthy people, you have people discharging raw sewage, that's often where action takes place. It's sad but true. Wealthier people tend to be better connected politically and can get action on cases like this. So that land has actually been bought, and we're actually working with the new owner to put in a decentralized treatment system. I'll talk about that in a little while. All right, so Hale County we also looked at. Hale County is just south of Tuscaloosa County, and only the southern part of Hale County is in the black belt soil. The northern part of the county, I mean, the soil's not great, but it's usually you can get a system to work. So we had more dwellings surveyed. We had a little over 400. It was about 50-50 between the mobile homes and the stick-built homes. 35% had a health department permitted system. I do want to mention in the northern part of the county, there is one municipality that's extremely strict on this and will really enforce it. And you can't get power, you can't get water connected, you can't sell a property unless you have a permitted system. That really changes things. in that northern part of the county. But in the southern part of the county, they've got this terrible soil. We did see a few straight pipes, but only 24, only 6%, right? So pretty low relative to what we'd seen in the other counties that have been surveyed. But the majority of our sample actually, they didn't have a permitted system. They didn't have a visible straight pipe. So either they've got a hidden straight pipe or they're trying to get wastewater into the ground in an informal way that's not permitted by the health department. And I just want to show you here, red soil is bad. So it's really low hydraulic conductivity. That's the area where we see most of the straight pipes, and the problems in Hale County is in that really, really bad soil. And yeah, I'll talk about one of the areas there where we're going to put a system. So data from local stakeholders. So expert knowledge, like I was saying, there are installers who've been working in these areas for a really long time. Asking the health department staff is a little bit dicey because if they claim to know about a straight pipe, they're supposed to actually cite the person who has it. And frankly, the health department used to do that, and they've backed off because it was just getting a lot of poor people into trouble with fines, into trouble with getting their home condemned. So there's been a push away from that towards basically looking the other way when it's a poor family, okay? And I have to say that approach is preferable to arresting people and fining people and getting them in even more financial trouble. But we need a real solution, and I'll talk about solutions shortly. Okay, so health department staff can't really give you details, but the installers can. They know everything that's going on in those areas. So the area of New Bern, which is in that really bad soil in Hale County, I talked to a guy, this guy, Tim Wenger. He's awesome. He's been over 20 years working in rural Alabama in this area. He said 10% of people in New Bern, this town of New Bern, have a permitted system, about 90% have unpermitted. He said 40% have like an informal system where they're trying to get wastewater into the ground, but they've hired an unlicensed person to do it. And then 50% have a straight pipe, okay? And he said 30%, the majority of those 50%, 30% of the total would have some sort of solid settling and then a discharge for the liquids. And then 20% would just be a pure straight pipe with no solid settling, toilet paper and everything comes out of the pipe. So then we did the flow routing and water sampling. And I just want to show very briefly the flow routing. So this is just a GIS map where there's little pipes with the discharge that would indicate like a straight pipe, okay? So if there's a straight pipe in that location, we can see which way that wastewater is going to go based on the topography when it rained. And then we can try to sample and capture that when we do our sampling in our wet weather sampling. So this is New Bern, and just that little red rectangle is kind of around the city limits of New Bern. That creek that runs to the east there, it runs right down to the east and then to the south. That's Big Prairie Creek. We can sample that creek upstream, adjacent to the town, and then downstream. And our flow routing has shown us, based on the way that wastewater moves, that at Road 61, we're going to capture basically all the wastewater that's discharged to the surface that's to the east of Road 61 there. And then Windmill Road, we're going to capture some of it, but not all. And then the ones up to the north, they're not capturing any of that. It's a pretty small watershed. So I would say relatively pristine, not a lot of human influence up there. So there was a big drought in 2016 that allowed us to show proof of concept that the sampling strategy worked. The drought is orange, and after it rained, it's blue. So we actually had a drought that lasted over 2 months with not a drop of rain in this area. So what happens over that time is you have all this wastewater accumulating on the surface, and then it rained hard right after Thanksgiving. So we were out there in the rain after Thanksgiving, basically catching all this contamination from the straight pipes as it flowed, it accumulated on the surface. So it's a log scale on the y-axis. So you really see no difference in the concentration of E. coli upstream to downstream during the drought. But after the drought, we see this massive flush of E. coli, okay? And that's our indicator organism for fecal contamination right there. So upstream, you see about a 10%, about a 10x increase, not 10%, it's a 10x increase, 10 times as much E. coli. And that's because all warm-blooded mammals also shed E. coli. So you find E. coli basically everywhere in the environment. When you get to midstream, adjacent to the town where some of that wastewater is going to be captured, we saw about a 100x increase from the drought condition. And then downstream, we saw about a 1,000x increase in E. coli from the drought condition. So that indicates to us that we really did have a lot of wastewater accumulating on the surface and that it's all flushing through. and we were able to catch that with our sampling. So we're going from trying to characterize the problem to trying to address the problem now. We still need to characterize the problem. We've only looked into a couple counties. There's many more counties to investigate, but we want to come up with solutions. So I'm going to talk about some barriers to solutions, like some of why this hasn't been solved, and then talk about some different solutions, and then looking at our partnerships and some resources to actually get this stuff done, which is not, it's not trivial to actually get this work done. So what are some solutions? We could expand or upgrade existing municipal sewer. So it just runs up to the city limit. We could expand it to adjacent communities, maybe even further. We could look at appropriate on-site systems. So the technologies exist. They're usually just not affordable for the household. We could identify clusters of homes and try to cluster those homes together into small treatment systems and treat that kind of in between a big sewer system and an on-site system. We could identify cost-effective treatment technologies for all of those, you know, whether an on-site system or a clustered system. Management entities, management is very challenging. Once you start networking homes together, someone has to be responsible for that system. If there's a fee associated, somebody's got to collect that fee. We've got financial models are really challenging because you've got really low population density and small numbers of people. And then also regulatory strategies. So what are the regulations that are getting in the way of solutions that could be, that are better than nothing, right? So, and then we want to develop a how-to guide. So if we come up with a solution for a certain community in a certain county, we want to have a guide that shows here are the applications that we submitted, here are the funding opportunities, here's where they could be applied. Here's a guide with some examples that you could use to apply for funding to get this problem solved in your area. Frankly, these local governments and these county governments don't have a huge amount of resources. They don't usually have full-time employees even, except maybe like one or two people who works in the office to get the water bills and everything. So it's very hard for them to find the time or the expertise to actually apply for this funding that could be available. All right, so we've got basically three categories of solutions for the wastewater itself. Connect to existing sewer. So most sewers in the Black Belt counties just run to the city limit. Connection fees can be very expensive. Most utility bylaws say that if you're connecting a new home, you can't raise the rates of other people to pay for that. So the person who's connecting has to pay the whole cost, which is just staggering sometimes. So in general, and I just got this from some home builder's site or something like that, but sewer line per foot to run a sewer main to a new area is going to cost 50 to 250 feet. So a mile, that's over $250,000 minimum. Could be over $1 million for a mile. So think about that. If you got a not very densely populated area and you're trying to run sewer main, immediately you've got a capital cost over $1 million. Okay, if you're running that to 20 homes, that's $50,000 a home. It's crazy just for 1 mile. Okay, there's also homes for the individual. There's also costs for the individual home to connect that can vary quite a bit. Hookup costs, especially for if the city or the town already has too much wastewater coming in, it could be really high because they don't want people to connect, okay? So there'll be a lot of permit fees and everything. And then there's just technical fees, okay? I do want to mention too, that from the 1940s to the 1980s, there was a huge amount of federal money that went into subsidizing water and wastewater, okay? In Alabama, a lot of African-American communities were discriminated against. They did not get those subsidies when they existed, and now they're being put in a situation where they have to pay 100% of the cost. And frankly, it's completely unfair and unjust. Okay, second, single home appropriate on-site wastewater treatment system. So conventional systems I talked about before, a gravel-filled trench or that chamber, those don't work in a lot of cases in rural Alabama. The most popular alternative for single home systems are mound systems, okay? There you build up above that bad soil and you try to use the mound as your unsaturated soil for the treatment, okay? Those can work. They're more expensive, out of the cost range, out of the price range for some people. Some people can't afford them, so that's a pretty popular alternative. They can also take up a huge amount of space. They look unsightly. People don't like them. It takes a nice backyard and puts this giant mound in there. So they're not very popular in that sense. There are other advanced options. I don't know if you talk about on site in your class at all, but aerobic treatment units. It's basically almost like a mini activated sludge plant where you have a pump and you blow air in. It's going to be more expensive. You're going to have ongoing costs to run that pump. Ideally, you're going to have like a tablet chlorinator on the back end to actually chlorinate that water if it's going to the surface. Not always practiced. Also, frankly, people can unplug that pump because they don't want to pay the extra energy bill. And I've seen a lot of that actually in Louisiana where I've worked, where they've got really high water table, and ATUs are popular. Drip systems. So drip systems can work in soils that can't accept a normal drain field. They're very expensive, very complicated to install. And then there are recirculating sand filters as well. Again, these systems are all going to be a lot more expensive. They're going to require, an engineer to stamp it. They're going to require a very specialized installation process, not just somebody coming out with a backhoe, digging a trench, laying some chamber, some gravel in there, covering it back up, which is basically the leveling. As long as you can get it leveled, that'll make a conventional septic system work. Okay, there is one thing that's changed recently in Alabama, and I don't even know if it's official yet. It's just in the past few weeks, but they're allowing the spray of gray water, okay? So not the toilet water, and often not the kitchen sink water, because sometimes people do chicken and stuff in the kitchen sink, but the gray water, so the shower water, the washing machine, the dishwasher, the sinks. There's a new regulation that can be sprayed onto the ground without an NPDES permit, without a discharge permit. It's actually a really, really old regulation that's resurfaced in the context of this problem. It's something we've been pushing for a few years, that the Department of Environmental Management has been stopping. The health department has really been pushing for, so people have some alternative to get rid of most of their water in a way that's actually feasible and deal with just a small volume of what's called the black water, the toilet water, so that can be treated. And then you can spray the gray water, which really isn't dangerous. It's just, it can have some nutrients in it. Anyway, that's something we're just now exploring, because it's just a couple weeks ago, they came to an agreement. So that'll be on the books soon. And then cluster decentralized collection and treatment. I really think this is the wave of the future in wastewater. Like I mentioned, running sewer line is enormously expensive these days. We've got basically, say $1 million a mile. We have sensor technology, information technology to remotely monitor and manage systems, and treatment technologies for these are coming way down in cost and getting better and better. They're getting popular in densely populated cities. I really think this is going to be the way that we're going to be doing wastewater treatment as a society over the coming decades, okay? There are challenges though. You can get wastewater into the ground with these systems. One thing I want you to notice is these are like smaller sewer systems, but we don't deal with the solids at the treatment facility, okay? We deal with the solids with the septic tank, and then it gets pumped every few years, just like a normal septic tank. That means we only have to deal with the liquids. That means treatment is much easier. And it also means there's less odor issues, okay? Those are big things. And we don't have to deal with handling solids at that treatment facility. So we don't have to go there as frequently. There's so many advantages to doing it this way. Here's just an example of how decentralized clusters could work. This is Wilcox County. Camden is the county seat. It's got a big sewer system. There's one other sewer system out to the west in a little town called Pine Hill. Serves a couple hundred people. We identified clusters that could take clustered systems. And just as an example, you could put the treatment unit in the middle, run 2-inch pipe, very cheap to run 2-inch pipe relative to a sewer main. And you don't need the scour velocities because you're only dealing with liquids. So you don't need to maintain a high velocity in your system. So you might not need a pump station. Ideally, you probably do need some pumping, but you don't have a grinder pump that has to deal with solids either, like you would have to if you were dealing with a big sewer system. So that's just an example. And then decentralized treatment options. We want modular options. So when we put in a system, we connect some homes, people see how great it works, they want to connect, we can add a treatment unit, okay? Modular is really important for decentralized clusters. So you're not just designing a huge system in case everyone hooks up, and rather instead you're designing a system for the demand that you have in the first place, maybe a little bit extra demand for a couple people who want to hook up. But if we get a lot more demand or we connect to another community, we add another treatment unit, okay? And there are some advanced systems like membrane bioreactors. In the upper right is what's called a Presby sand filter. Those are getting really popular both for on-site and for decentralized clusters. I really think that might be our best path to an in-ground disposal system in the Black Belt. Okay, financing and management are big, big problems. I see we're coming up towards the end of the time. Yeah, this is a big issue. We got big economies of scale. So the more homes we can get connected, the more this is feasible. Regulation and permitting, if it goes into the ground, the health department's in charge of it. If it goes discharged to the surface, the Department of Environmental Management's in charge. We really want to stay on the health department side as much as possible. We have a lot of ongoing activities. Like I mentioned, we got Columbia University, Georgia Tech, UC Irvine, Auburn, University of South Alabama, University of North Carolina. Lots of people involved right now. We've actually got a consortium together that's got the governor's office, both senators' offices from our state, our local representative, Terry Sewell. She's like a champion for rural wastewater. So I'm going to wrap it up there, see if we have like 2 minutes for questions. Acknowledgements are extensive. It's not just me. There's many, many people involved in making this happen. I'm going to stop and give you 2 minutes to talk before I guess you have to go to your next class.
Mark, that was awesome. I learned so much, and I mean, I'll let you all ask questions because I can ask questions later. But looks like Ryan has a question. Go for it.
Yeah, I was wondering how the decentralized cluster systems work when there's like poor soil.
Yeah, so if you have poor soil, then you're going to need to do some surface discharge, okay? If you have to do surface discharge, then you're going to need an NPDES permit for your surface discharge. However, when you have a clustered system, it's more feasible to do a permit for like 20 homes than it is for one home. I mean, it was so crazy, the Department of Environmental Management telling these rural mobile home people, oh, you need an NPDES permit, you need monthly testing. I'm like, what is wrong with you people? So, but if the more you cluster, the more economies of scale you get, the more feasible all those things get.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Super cool. Does anyone else have a question? I had a quick one that I can follow up to, Mark. So I know you talked about you were kind of focusing on Alabama, but given that that kind of black belt soil goes up into Mississippi as well, is that same problem kind of extended into that part?
It is absolutely, yeah. So I talked to the guy who's in charge of on-site wastewater for Mississippi, and the approach in Mississippi has actually been substantially different than Alabama. So in Mississippi, the health department is allowing people to do some treatment and then spray.
Okay.
And the Department of Environmental Management in Mississippi has not gotten in the way of that. Whereas in Alabama, the Department of Environmental Management has put basically a total block on that process. So there are jokes in Alabama, oh, that's a Mississippi septic tank. It's just a pipe to a trench or something. But they're trying to allow people to do something that can be permitted instead of saying, no, it's the gold standard or nothing, which is basically what Alabama's been saying. So they're different philosophical approaches. What it creates is more urgency to solve the problem in Alabama than in Mississippi. But I think we've been hoping to expand into Mississippi to try to put some decentralized clustered systems in over there. They've also got water table issues over by the Mississippi River in southwestern Mississippi. Big problems that are really common in Louisiana too, with really high water table. Where both those states have come up with a sort of compromise to enable some surface discharge from homes, just because providing some treatment is better than just Wild West, which is what we have in Alabama, which is everybody's on their own. And either they're going to say, no, that system's going to cost you $15,000 and it's more than someone's annual income, or they got nothing.
And similar kind of issues, with some of these like systemic things like poverty and racism and things like that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So one thing that's really important, actually, if you're working in a situation like this, there's a culture. There's a lot of talk in engineering about making sure that you're being sensitive to the population you're working with and the culture of that population. There's also a regulatory culture. Okay, so the way that I frame things when I'm talking to an audience in Alabama that includes regulators, that includes people from the state government, the legislature, I frame things in terms of fairness. Like I frame things in terms of this isn't right? These people were left behind. They didn't get the subsidies when they were available, and now we're telling them they have to pay 100%. Whereas all these wealthy people had systems that were 90% subsidized. That's just not right. Whereas if I'm talking to an academic audience, I'm going to talk about environmental justice and social justice. But you really have to think about that. There's a lot of researchers who the way that they're framing their research has a lot to do with appealing to their in-group, and it's not really taking into account whether that's going to adversely affect the likelihood their research will actually be successful and actually get the outcome they say they want. So whenever you're talking to think you understanding your audience and what your audience cares about and how your audience is going to read into what you say. I mean, we have such a polarized political environment right now. Try to think about ways to frame it so that it appeals to everyone, not just to your in-group.
Amazing.